catch up? Because the video wasn't up yet.
No, I wasn't. I was looking for the video that I saw.
Yeah, there was a problem with reinstallation of the broadband, and it was waiting for Bezic. Supposedly they were here yesterday, so as we speak, all the videos are being uploaded. Any questions about what we were talking about? Wonderful. So let's just continue with what we were talking about last time was the difficulty with conflicts that don't get resolved and the difficulty of resolving conflicts. Then if you recall, we talked about conflict as an opportunity for intersubjective work, an opportunity for people to understand what it is that they really have trouble believing that the other person can tolerate. It's not what I can't tolerate, it's connected to it. Because I can't believe that the other person can tolerate something about me. A need for closeness, a need for control, a need for respect. And at the level of regulation, conflict is often settled by some sort of a compromise. But that's basically a platform for going beyond that and trying to work on the basis of the conflict. So when you're dealing with a couple and you get people who it's sort of obvious to you how to make a compromise, and if you recall in the exercise, the one thing that we did not allow, although it slipped in one of the groups, we did not allow compromises based on space or on time. Remember? In other words, the light is off in one place and it's on in another place, that space, the light is on and then it's off and then it's on, compromise in time. And those will sometimes get to a point where it's possible to begin to work, but it's not the work. It's the platform that makes the work possible. Then we came to the point of talking about what's called the Psychosomatic Trial. And there, I think things went 100% clear, so we'll go back over it. When parents have a conflict that they themselves are not able to resolve, then children sometimes feel that they're called upon to modulate the conflict. It doesn't resolve the conflict. And if you recall the three places that the child could take, the child could be allied with one parent, the child could be allied with either parent depending on who's down at a given time, or the child can have an illness. And the illness will distract the illness will distract the parents from being able to resolve their conflict. Remember that? So you'll remember it. In the future you'll remember it. So we're talking about the third case where the child distracts the parents from the conflict. It works like a regulation, right? In other words, if you remember, what we said was the child, in the case of Minuchin's research, the child is watching the parents. When it's watching the parents alone, the child has a certain level of stress, and the stress is a biochemical marker for it, but there's a certain level of stress that the child feels. The psychosomatic child starts at a higher level of stress than the non-psychosomatic child. But then, when the therapist and the therapist enters the room and starts to discuss the conflict, so it becomes more focused, and then the behavioral and the normal child with this case of diabetes will feel about the same stress. You see these movements these movements here are not significant. The psychosomatic child, the stress will go up when this conflict goes up. When the child enters the room together with the parents and the therapist, so that's the worst possible situation. Now bear in mind, when you're doing therapy, that's your situation, right? That's where you're at. You're in the room with the parents and the child, so you're in the worst possible situation, where people are the most stressed as possible. And then, so there, even the behavioral or the normal child with diabetes, the stress will go up a little bit. It's barely significant, but a little bit. And with the psychosomatic child, it continues to go up. But when the child gets to leave the room, and the child says, okay, you guys, I'm out of here. I'm going to go and watch you with the therapist, but I'm not part of this. So then, in a normal and the behavioral diabetic child, the stress goes down. I went in, and when I'm in, I'm more stressed. When I'm out, I'm less stressed. Now that all makes sense. The extraordinary thing that Mnuchin found with the so-called psychosomatic diabetic child is when they left the room, they took the stress with them. In other words, leaving the room of the therapist and the parents and just going out and watching them, the stress continued to go up. And that was only in the children with what's called psychosomatic diabetes. So this was an extraordinary experiment which gives you a picture of what it can be like for a child where an illness short-circuits the conflict between the parents. And what does that mean? That when the parents are in conflict, the child brings the conflict onto himself. That's like the child who's sick with a headache when the lights are on, and with a panic attack when the lights are off. No matter what, the child is not doing well. So in this case, the diabetic child, the stress of the parents is going to continue to increase the stress of the child until what happens? They get sick. They start to have symptoms of diabetic stress, and then what will happen? Then the parents will stop being in conflict about who they are. Do you love me enough? Do you control me too much? Do you respect me enough? And they'll start to think, how are we going to save this child's life, right? And they'll be in the emergency room. And at the point where the child is sick, the conflict goes down. Now, what I started to say last time, which is what I wanted you to appreciate, is that one could say that the parents are creating the diabetes. That was sort of what Mnuchin was thinking about. It's an old sort of linear causality kind of model that you see if these parents could resolve their conflict, the child wouldn't have this diabetic problem, or it would be resolved in a different way. But because the parents can't solve their conflict, so the parents are at fault. Everything you read in Mnuchin tends to degenerate into causality and into blaming parents. And so it's one of the limiting parts of Mnuchin's theory. But if you think about it, and you say, wait a minute, maybe these parents were able to solve conflicts before their child had diabetes, like anybody else. In other words, they have a conflict, and conflict needs time. You need time, you need sometimes, if you think about conflicts that you've seen in your neighbors, God forbid in yourself, so you'll see that you start to have a conflict, you take a break, you go back to it, you stay with it. You can't resolve a conflict instantly. You can make a compromise instantly, but you can't resolve a conflict instantly. It needs a spread of time. And we're imagining this same family, that before the child had diabetes, they were resolving conflicts, roughly speaking, the way most people were. And then the child got diabetes, which by itself is one huge stress, because now you have a child who needs medical attention, who has to have needles in and out all the time, and you have to figure out parenting for how to deal with this situation, and that increases the stress. And then, when they get into conflict, the child gets sick. So when the child gets sick, what happens to their ability to resolve conflict? Goes down, right? In other words, what happens when you're dealing with a chronic illness is that will reduce the differentiation of in the family. What is it? Remember what it means to reduce differentiation? The I position of each of them is diminished because each of them is saying, what does it matter what I feel? We have to save the child. What does it matter? Just put it all aside so the I positions get diluted, and instead we have to run to the emergency room. So we have to run to the emergency room that we agree on. That we have to. So what do they end up agreeing on? They agree when the child is sick, and the conflict is put aside. You see how that would lower the level of differentiation? So when you see families that are stressed with chronic illness, you want to say to yourself, not, okay, if these people were normal, we wouldn't have this illness. It's wiser to say, they must have had a higher level of differentiation that's being stressed out and lowered by having to deal with this illness. And then you would say to yourself, let's say you were a social worker in a pediatric endocrinology unit, or if you were a social worker in the asthma clinic, and you saw that there were some kids who keep, coming in all the time, and then you see that when you talk to the parents, they're not exactly together about anything except taking care of the asthma. And so when the kid needs more asthma treatment, the parents are regulated. They're not resolving anything, but they're regulated. So then you would say to yourself, I wonder what the contribution of the medical treatment is to this lowering the differentiation. See, as we're going from the child or the family to society, one of the great problems with an ill child is that your system is open. Family systems like to be more or less closed. That means you solve things by yourselves. They always get open when the kid goes to school. That's one opening of the school, of the system. But if your kid behaves itself in school, the school doesn't bother you. And then the system stays pretty closed. When your kid is sick, your system is wide open. So if your child is in the hospital, has to stay in the hospital, your system is in the hospital. The family is there. And everybody's looking at the family and wondering what's the matter with it, right? So it's a family that is forced to be open. And then you say to yourself, I wonder what the differentiation is of the caretaking system. This is something I'm going to talk about more as we get more expanding with the family. But you say to yourself, what is it in the caretaking system that would help differentiation? And what is it in the caretaking system that would diminish differentiation? So now just think, you have we'll blame the doctor, it could be the head nurse of the clinic, but let's take the doctor. The doctor says to the parents, you are fantastic parents for this child. Let's go to asthma. Asthma is a little easier because, it comes and goes faster. Diabetes is a little bit of a slower process. They say, well, you came at just the right moment, and so we see that you're really attuned to the asthma. And because you're so well attuned to the asthma, we want to make you even more attuned to the asthma. So we're going to make you experts about asthma. And every time you come in with the child, we say to you, you've really taken good care of the child because you came to the emergency room early. Now think about what this is going to do at home. Every little and the parents have been reinforced to run to the emergency room, right? That means that whenever they have any conflict about mother-in-law or whatever, all the kid has to do is and the conflict is finished, and they regulate themselves. They're going to the emergency room where they're praised to the high heavens for being such good parents of an asthmatic child, until they get in the emergency room every day, and then somebody wakes up and says, why are you guys in the emergency room every day? And the answer is because you helped us to think that that's how we should be. So, well, no, we didn't do that. You see, so when you're a caretaker, you want to ask yourself what the impact of caretaking is on differentiation. Now, that would be like a small miracle. If this happens in the emergency room, everybody says Al-Anisim. The kid comes in the third time in a week, wheezing, and the social worker at the clinic, we won't suspect medical caretakers of this, but the social worker in the clinic says, listen, it's pretty, something's out of whack here. And it might not just be the asthma. Tell me what you were talking about at home before the asthma attack started. Did you have time to finish it? And the parents say, we never remember what we're talking about because whenever, whatever, and we have to run. So let's say you didn't run. Let's say you said to him, you know, this particular can wait an hour. Take your thing and go out of the room. That's the research here. Go out of the room and let us finish resolving what we're talking about. We think we can do it. And then if you're still wheezing, we'll go to the emergency room, right? So a psychosomatic asthmatic child will lower the level of wheezing because the parents have taken responsibility for resolution of the conflict. Now, that never happens, never. That's one of the big problems with the differentiation level of health caretakers, that they think they're dealing only with the child and not with the level of differentiation in the family, whereas the child's illness and the way it's handled is going to challenge and lower the level of differentiation of the family. And a lot of times when you're called to consult, what you need to do is, rather than say to the parents, look, resolve your conflicts, because they're 3 years into not resolving any conflicts and just and run into the emergency room, you have to start with the clinic and say, listen, let's have another look. This kid never gets into real danger, but he always is distracting the family. How about if we try for a month to change our view of it and say, you know, when you come to the emergency room, we will take care of your child, and then we will say, okay, now that we're taking care of your child, somebody's going to sit with you and talk with you about what was going on at home before your child started to wheeze. As I say, that never happens. But you can see that that's like an obvious way, if you look at the issue of psychosomatic as something that you're not blaming the parents for, but you're saying it's burdening the parents. Let's help them out. Let's help a family when they're burdened with a child with a chronic illness, not to have that lower their level of differentiation, right? In which case you would assume that there would be a family evaluation with one of our one-way mirrors and some of our marvelous therapists here for every child who has a chronic illness, wouldn't it be, right? There'd be a one-way mirror in the clinic, the asthma clinic and the diabetes clinic and the epilepsy clinic, and there would be a discussion about the impact of this illness on your family's level of differentiation. That would be called preventive treatment. When that happens, it's halal and al-hanism. Yeah.
So when this epileptic or diabetes or whatever goes into adulthood, the child no longer has a function of differentiating the family.
Of lowering the differentiation.
Of lowering the level of differentiation in the family, why is it continuing to adulthood?
What?
Why would it continue into adulthood?
If it's a psychosomatic issue, then when you lower the level of, when you increase the level of differentiation in the family, in other words, when you help them to resolve conflicts rather than have the child's illness regulate the conflict, then the illness will become less psychosomatic. Will it disappear? Probably not, because probably no level of parental conflict can create diabetes or epilepsy, right? That's a little bit silly that, you know, it created the asthma. But it's certainly more than reasonable to say that the way that the illness is handled makes the illness worse or better. The point of a psychosomatic illness is that it has a role in regulating a family that doesn't regulate itself and doesn't resolve conflict. So it has a role.
You don't think it's possible that an illness can develop because of a dysfunctional household?
Right. Now, Gabrielle's asking a question from the 70s, so it has a real, you know, has a beard longer than yours, this question. And the answer is, we don't know. But it's probably not a wise idea to assume that. In other words, you say to yourself, okay, well maybe the stress in the family created asthma. Probably not. We don't have any evidence for it. There were people who assumed it. But will it impact on the expression of asthma? Yes. Will it impact on the expression of diabetes? Yes. Will it impact on the expression of epilepsy? Yeah, because stress in the child, if the child is taking the stress on himself, it'll be more expressed. Now, let's just take epilepsy, for example. Can family differentiation create epilepsy? Let's assume not. But let's assume that a certain level of stress, a child who has a propensity for epilepsy will express it. And at a lower level of stress, it won't be expressed. Same with asthma, that there's some sort of physical something or other that's in the kid's lungs, but it won't be expressed when he's cool. But it will be expressed when he's taking on the family's stress. And so then you're talking about not the genotype, you're talking about the phenotype. From phenos to the phenomenon. In other words, you'll see the asthma, and at other points you won't see the asthma. When you don't see the asthma, does that mean the asthma is gone? That's both a philosophical and a medical question. Let's assume that the propensity is there, but it's not being expressed. Can family stress create the propensity for epilepsy in a child with no tendency to epilepsy? Probably not. Can it help? Can dealing with a family help it to be much less expressed? Probably yes. Okay? So, and if you look at it as a decision tree, you'll see that your question is moot. In other words, there's no way to test it. And anyway, if the family is causing it, or if the family is being impacted in a circular way by it, it's the same treatment, right? In which case you don't have to answer the question to know what to do. When you see the results of doing it, you still won't answer the question, but things will be better. Yeah.
What about encopresis?
Oh, okay. So encopresis. We can talk about encopresis. We can talk about enuresis. We'll talk about later. We'll start with the hard stuff, and then we'll have a whole session on bedwetting because it's connected to some things we're going to learn about. But let's take encopresis. So those of you, anybody know what encopresis is? There are two forms of encopresis. There are kids who never manage to really get toilet trained, and so they are not controlling themselves. And there are kids who were trained and then started to soil themselves. The kids who have not been trained is usually a combination of what goes on in the way the training was done. Obviously, if the two parents are fighting about every time, where we should sit and how we should sit, so that's not going to make it easier. And sometimes there's a weakness of some sort of a misfit between the kid and the parents about it. And there it's mainly a developmental thing. Now, that's what's called primary encopresis. Primary means the child was never clean. And primary encopresis is either a developmental issue or a parental issue or a combination of the two, something of a fit, how to get this particular kid to have it work when it's a kid who freaks out or a kid who doesn't listen so well. So, you have to adjust the way that you do something as intimate and complex as toilet training. Right? Now, Freud was the one who taught us that toilet training is an intimate and complex matter, and it should be paid attention to as such. It's no less intimate than sexuality because it's one of the roots of sexuality. In other words, a child who's being toilet trained is in an intimate sphere, and so it's not something that can be handled only with, or for a lot of kids can't be handled only with just do it because Mikey, just do it. That doesn't work for a lot of kids. And so you have to know what the feces mean, what it means to sit in the pot, how it's being reinforced. It's a whole story. It's an intimate and complex matter. So it may have gone awry, and you may have to roll it back and say, was it a difficulty, a fit between the way the parents think and the way the kid reacts, and try to take care of it. Sometimes there are what we call neurotic aspects to it. How can you be neurotic at the age of 3? You can be neurotic by having a childish misunderstanding about bodily functions. Childish misunderstandings about bodily functions. Childish misunderstandings about bodily functions. What is a childish misunderstanding about bodily function in a 2.5-year-old who mother just had another baby, or a second baby perhaps, right? Now what does the mother's having a baby have to do with sitting on the pot, things come out from the bottom, right? Now, if you have a childish understanding of the bottom, which has only one place of exit, and there's only one place of entrance, and the place of entrance is when you eat. And when you eat, your belly gets big, and then your belly is big, and mommy's belly is big, so undoubtedly she got pregnant by eating. This is how children think until you inform them otherwise, and sometimes after. So then a child may say to himself, as I have to admit my son did after his younger sister was born, that if this comes out, I'm going to have a baby. Right? That's neurotic, right? In other words, he put together those things based on a childish misunderstanding of bodily functions. And what do? You either deliver him or get him to understand that that's not going to happen, that it's a different exit mode, and that things clear up. So these are sort of common things that children think. It's, if you think about children and the body and in and out, it's pretty obvious to them. That connects with their concrete experience. They're at the level of concrete experience. There's no way for them to make other connections unless you help them with it. So that would be a neurotic way in which training goes awry. Then what's more common are the places where a kid has been trained, the training went okay, and then they stop. And there, when it's secondary encopresis, a lot of times it is a family issue. And what you end up finding is that, this business of soiling then creates a family meeting, and the family meeting, it becomes psychosomatic. In other words, every time that the child soils, the parents stop talking about anything else except this, and then they either praise the doctors to the heaven for God knows what, or curse the doctors to the other direction because they haven't solved it yet, but they're not talking about what's between them, they're talking about the soiling. Those children, generally speaking, at some point start to feel that it's better not to have a bowel movement than to have a bowel movement. And what they start to do is start withholding bowel movements. Sometimes when they're in Gan, they withhold. What happens is that they end up expanding their colon. What you can do if you hold on and becomes constipated in an extreme degree, what you end up doing is creating what's called a megacolon. The colon expands, and as it expands, the muscles have less ability to contract, and you have less control over it, right? So you end up with this dried up massive feces in the colon, which the child can't exit, and if he did, it would be something like labor. It would be a lot of pain because it's bigger than it should be, and drier and so forth. But since everything is stopped up there, the material that's supposed to go into the colon is liquid. Everything that goes into the colon is liquid, and it dries out. There's the washer and the dryer. The washer is the small intestine, the dryer is the large intestines, just to sort of simplify matters a bit. So when the liquid goes into the dryer, but the dryer is full, so the liquid leaks out. And that's where you have most of the problems with secondary encopresis, because the child cannot control, but he's not having normal bowel movements. He's soiling liquid material, which is leaking around the megacolon. And so when that happens, you can't expect the child to solve it. No CBT in the world will resolve a megacolon. In order to resolve a megacolon, you have to use either enemas or it's wiser to use mineral oil. Mineral oil simply flushes the dryer. Everything comes out. You use that for a while because the colon has to heal. It has to get down to a normal size. If it's not back to a normal size, it will stop drying the way it's supposed to and get stopped up again. So it's a combination of a medical and then but our issue is, can we see that as psychosomatic? The answer is, oh yeah. Would you say that the parents or the way that the child was handled created the problem? In this case, you're closer to that. But the fact that a parental conflict that wasn't handled created the megacolon doesn't mean the megacolon goes away the minute that the parents say happy, happy, happy. You can't solve that kind of encopresis with couples therapy. You also have to let the bowel heal. So there's an issue that has to do also with parents realizing, what nature has done and how it will take some time to heal. Yeah.
So is there a psychological component that has to be addressed with the child? Like if let's say a child has this issue, would the child also have to...
Right, so when you're dealing with this kind of encopresis, you'll need to deal with the psychological aspects of it afterwards. But you can't solve it just with psychology. Although some psychologists wish they could, you have to do it together with the pediatrician. You have to clean things out and empty things out and let them heal. It takes a couple of weeks. And then you deal with the child about a couple of things. Partly what the misunderstandings were that led him to freak out and to withhold, and partly what the meaning for him and for the family has been of this behavior, right? Because if the family has now, he realizes that once he has a megacola and he leaks, every time he leaks the parents are better regulated because they're angry at him but not at each other, for example, or they're angry at the doctor and not at him and not at each other. So then the psychological part needs to be dealt with, but it's not as simple, if you solve the psychology, it'll go away. That's a common error on the part of psychologists who say, oh, since there's a psychological origin to it, so there's only a psychological origin to it, so you don't really have to deal with the bowel, you just have to deal with the psychology. In this case, it's not the case. Yeah.
I know the case. The child had, I guess, megacolon, and they went to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, you have to give them suppositories. The kid was like 3 years old, maybe 4 years old.
4, right.
And you have to, and so they force the child suppositories while the child's kicking and screaming over the course of 2 months until the mother realized that there's something wrong with this advice.
With his?
Something wrong with this advice.
Right.
And so, as a teenager, this child has lots of issues. Which, what kind of things could develop from that?
You name it. If the child were obsessional, then you would go back to Freud and say, Ziggy nailed it, right? There it is. He has anal problems, and it's expressed. All of that is organized in sexuality around anal things to express, and then he's cheap, right? He's cheap and he's clean. In other words, he's obsessional. So that would be nice. It might be the case, but it could be that he has a problem with trust, or it could be that he has a problem with intrusiveness, because suppositories is not the way to do it, because it's intrusive. That's why drinking mineral oil, although it's disgusting, is better than using enemas, which are, have a certain meaning to them. And if the bottom is erotized, is the center of sexuality at that time, so insertions in the bottom is not such a great idea. It's not a neutral area. There's been another 10 years of all sorts of developments of meanings, and 10 years is half a generation, and we're going to learn how to parse time over in another session or two. And so it's hard to resolve everything back only to what happened then, but it's undoubtedly part of it because it was a mess in a few ways. Yeah.
So I know someone else, like a little girl who had an issue, and they took her to a psychologist or psychiatrist, I don't know, and they said she had like a fear of control.
Right.
Would you say that has nothing to do with the environment, or could just be a personality in itself?
Okay, now if you don't mind, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. What do you think? Let's take your question. You see, I have the suspicion that behind every good question is a pretty good answer.
Well,
So
because they said it was behavioral. They said it was a behavioral issue.
they said what?
They said it was like a behavioral issue, not like a psychology behavior. So
Right.
they went about it in a
So we're making artificial distinctions in the world, right? That there's behavioral and there's psychological. Go figure out how you cut that one. And it could be control, or it could be something else. Yeah. In other words, that's when you see applied. All of these theories are in the back of your mind, but in the front of your mind is an individual person who has put these things together in a certain way. So in the back of your mind, every now and then something jumps. You say, ah, there it is. Okay, keep your mouth shut at that time because it's too exciting. You don't want to jump on the client. But You don't know yet. In other words, it's some combination of all of those things and all of the theories that will tell you what it is, and only that. Those are theories that are showing their limitations. The word only is never accurate. It's sometimes fun. In other words, when somebody's discovering something, Freud was and still is criticized because he uses the word only in German. Nur is the same as in Yiddish. He says nur all the time. And so they say, you see, this guy, he was what's called a reductionist, right? He reduced everything to control. He reduced everything to the family. Oh no, we're not doing that here. We're not reducing everything to the family. We're seeing the family side of it, but we're not reducing everything only to the family. Why did Freud use the word only so much? Because in the early part of the 20th century, everybody knew that he was making an ironic comment. And the ironic comment was taken from Sherlock Holmes. You see, when Holmes says to Watson, it's elementary, he's always saying, well, it could only be this, and it could only be this, and it could only be... It's a literary sense. Freud wasn't writing scientifically when he used the word nur. He was a marvelous writer, but he knew that his readers in 1915 could know what the word only means in an intelligent discussion. It took only 20 years for people to forget what it meant, and then they started, bashing him for being reductionist. But we could use the word only if we wanted to be literary about it. We say, isn't that nice? This fits into Watson, not Sherlock Holmes. Watson behavior. Oh, this fits into CBT. Oh, look at that. There's Minuchin. Oh, Bowen just became a star, or even Freud. That's nice for us, right? But the question is how it helps us to understand the person who's put it together, including everything. There is no human phenomenon. Remember when we started? We talked about multiple function. So we talked about how it's connected to the ego, and to the drives, and to the superego, and to the family, and. That makes life either overwhelmingly complicated and annoying, or interesting. That's up to you. I think it makes it interesting. At times when you're learning, it sometimes becomes annoying. But when you're seeing a client, you don't want to be annoyed at them, right? So you want to be able to say that this is, we have stuff in the back of our mind. Sooner or later, what's in the back of my mind, which is the stuff you're learning here, and what's in front of your face, which is a human being, they'll meet at certain moments, and you'll be very gratified. And that's when you should be quiet until you figure out, because it's not as simple as you think it is, but it's very gratifying. Let's try to go on a little, and then we'll take some more questions. So I think you got the idea of what we're talking about, that psychosomatic is not only psychosomatic. We just took the only out, but it could act in a certain way that could be confusing. Now,
one more.
No.
What is it? What happens? How is it interpreted by the child when the parents are arguing?
How what?
When the parents are arguing, how is it interpreted by the child?
Behind that question is the answer. No. What do you think?
It's in the unstable environment. I don't know.
Okay. Unstable environment, I mean the child is frightened, right? In other words, the sense of security that is not regulated, right? And guilt, right? Because when children, up until the age of about 120, but certainly until about 12, and certainly below 8, when something is happening, the child is always saying,
It's my fault.
I did it, right? There aren't any other causes in the world for a child especially in pre-operational thinking, and certainly before abstract thinking. So children tend to say, it's me, it's because of me.
Until the age of 12.
What's that?
Until the age of 12.
Say that again?
Until the age of 12.
Until the age of 120, because we're all children in some way, depending how stressed we are. But under the age of 7, children don't have another idea. In other words, unless they're allied with the father, and then they say it's the mother's fault, but they really mean it's my fault because I'm allied with the father. So there's guilt, so there's a lack of security, and there's guilt, and anything new.
Is that necessarily true that a child will always feel like their parents fighting is because of them?
No, nothing is ever always, but it's always in our mind. In other words, when you say the parents are fighting, when you deal with divorce cases, and you say, well, what was the cause of the divorce? So a child, say 8 or 9, will say, well, they sat down and talked to you, right? Oh, that talk, I remember that talk. They said blah, 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 I remember that. And what did you think? I thought it was my fault. And did they say that it's not your fault? I said, so what? I know. In other words, children tend towards that. Tending and always are not the same, right?
Right. Now, I'm just curious, because that sounds a little counterintuitive to me. Like, how would that come about? Why do children do that?
Why do children do that? A short course in Piaget. Anybody remember Piaget? Did you guys have to go through Piaget at some point? Okay. So there's 2 tendencies. The first is the tendency to assimilation, and the other is the tendency to accommodation. Human beings, Piaget thought, at least Swiss human beings, tend beginning to assimilate. Assimilate means that however it is that I'm thinking, that's how it is, right? So, and accommodation means, oops, the map is not exactly right. There's a crack in the map, and the map and reality aren't the same, so I'll change the map, right? So putting the map on reality is assimilating, and changing the map through reality is accommodating. And there are 3 major phases that children go through, where they go from assimilation to accommodating. The first is sensory motor. Sensory motor means no thinking, right? Sensory motor means I'm a cat, there's a mouse, right? So I'm going to reach for the mouse, but if it's not there, it's just not there, because it's only there. Sensory, I'm seeing it, and motor, I'm going for it, right? So when it's not there, it's gone. I won't go look for it. It's gone. It's defined by my seeing it, right? That's assimilating. Assimilating to what I see and what I react to. That's what reality is. Accommodation is, oh, it's not here, but I can go look for it. I can go look for it because it has existence separate from sensory and motor. So you can hide it 3 times, and the kid will know that it exists. That's what's called object permanence. And that means, oh, the world is there, not just when I'm looking at it. That's a big change. The world is there, even when I'm not looking at it. Okay, so we've accommodated. But then we have what's called concrete experience. Concrete experience is, I know that it's there, but what does it mean? It means what it means to me. Why are there 2 mountains, Switzerland? Why is this big mountain and this small mountain? Children ask the question, why, right? Piaget was smart enough to say, you tell me why, because I think you have an answer behind the question. And the children would say, oh, one for big trips and one for small trips. Now, that's not very objective, is it? No, because it's assimilating, right? In other words, what am I going to do with these mountains? Take a big trip, take a small trip. That's what the world means, right? That now pre-operational concrete thinking is till the age of 6 or 7. And then you decenter, which means you start to accommodate and say, wait a minute, what if I never get to a trip? Would there still be a big mountain and a small mountain? Oh, so it's there, not just the way I would make it, okay? Put that into the family. Oh, so they're arguing not just because of me, right? That will start to happen when you're at your best between 7 and 11. But when your parents are arguing, you're not at your best, huh? And when you're not at your best, you tend to go back to assimilating. You step backwards when you're under stress. So children from 7 to 11 with help can figure it out, but without help they can't, because they go back to what did I do and how can I control it? Because it's all about me, right? That the meanings of the world is all about me. That's a short course. I think I want to get to conflict, and then if there's still questions at the end, we'll get to it. Did anybody go through the Family Crucible, Chapter 10? Good. Okay, so here we are, David, Caroline, Claudia as the IP, a wild adolescent, Don and Laura. Everybody remember them? The Bryce family, your favorite family therapy case, the one that you will learn everything from except for the small things that we'll add in this course. Okay, so tell me the story. I'm going to show you the slides, you tell me the story. Good.
Claudia acting out and Carolyn and David keeping them separate from dealing with their own issues.
Right, Carolyn is going nuts over Claudia, and David is saying, well, he's saying in parentheses, if he didn't have a crazy mother, she might be a normal child. So look at the way you're reacting, because he's being linear. He's not saying, this is part of a circle. He's saying, you drove her nuts. Why? Because at this particular moment, you're driving her nuts. And you're driving me nuts too, but we're not telling you that. We're just sort of, so, okay, that's good. Now, the therapists do something. They say to David, would you sit here and shut up, please? Right? If it was Mnuchin, they would move his chair. Whitaker, that was a little bit different way of doing it. But they said to David, I'll tell you what, let's hang in there for a minute, and let's, the easiest way to do it for David is to say, David, come sit with me. And you and I are going to now, it's going to be a rocky ride, but we're going to let Carolyn and Claudia have it out. Now, David is saying, the world is going to explode. The real conflict is between Carolyn and Claudia. That's the real conflict. I can't do that. I say, David, sit here, I'll rub your head, sit and be quiet. Let them try to go on and do something. What happens? Carolyn and Claudia are able to resolve their conflict, right? When David stays out of it, right, when the third party stays out of the conflict, then Carolyn and Claudia are able to start to understand each other. So that seems opposite, right? David said it's going to explode, and it turns out he was part of the problem, not part of the solution. He was part of the regulatory solution, which impeded the intersubjective solution. Okay? We're using language that he was pulling the differentiation down. There was a triangle. There wasn't a meeting of two I positions. And when he left it alone, the two I positions met, and Carolyn and Claudia started to understand each other. Right? If you haven't read it, read it. And then, so we have individuation and solution, and differentiation. And then, now what's going to happen? We're going to take Carolyn and say, Carolyn, okay, you see, you and your daughter understand each other. I wonder what's going to happen between your husband and your daughter. Oh, well, that should be like no problem because they're always allied with each other, right? So they should understand each other well. Opposite is the case. When two people are allied, they can't afford even conflict, right? In other words, Carolyn and Claudia could afford conflict, but David can't afford conflict with Claudia at all. And so he makes this alliance with her. What happens if Carolyn stops keeping the David-Claudia show going? See, because in one thing you could say David is inhibiting the Carolyn-Claudia show. You could also say that Carolyn is facilitating the David-Claudia show because it's a worse show. It's going to explode. And indeed, David and Claudia are not able to talk to each other at all. They have nothing to say to each other except that Carolyn is crazy. And now Claudia is not saying Mom is crazy, and she doesn't have anything else to talk to her father about. So you see, the big losers are the people who ally with each other because they don't enter any kind of conflict. At least with Claudia and Carolyn, it was alive. With David and Claudia, it wasn't alive. It was kind of, frozen as it were. We're alive, but we're alive because we're the same, not because we're different and can differentiate. Okay? It's important. You'll see this all the time in families. Carolyn, the big fight between Claudia and Carolyn, that's the most differentiated part of the family. The symptom is the most differentiated part. It makes the most noise. And the people who are less differentiated are the ones who are saying, if these people would just stop it, it would be fine. That's because he and Claudia have nothing to say to each other, except that Carolyn's nuts. So Carolyn and Claudia stop being nuts, and it turns out that David and Claudia have a big problem. They have a big problem which needs to be healed, right? And so we've solved one problem and stumbled upon a deeper problem. That's what's called therapy. You solve one thing, and it gets worse. You get into something else that couldn't even appear. One second. And then...
All of a sudden, at that moment, Claudia becomes suddenly closer to her mother, whereas before she always felt identity with her father.
A pseudo-closeness with her father. But the pseudo-closeness was only when we're complaining about mom. So mom has to come and scream, and then David and Claudia are best friends. But when mom and Claudia talk to each other, and now they're not screaming and they're saying, you know, I remember when I was a teenager, you know, I really need a mother. And Claudia could say, and this guy who keeps lying with me is keeping me away from my mother. That's not a solution, right? So I'm going to talk, the therapist changes the balance. And now David and Claudia have a cutoff which needs to be healed over time. There's going to be something that has to do with David's adolescence and his daughter that needs to be healed. But now we're going to take Claudia out of the picture, right? Say, okay, Claudia, we got it. You and your dad, there's something cold there that needs to be warmed up. But how about if you sit for a moment now, see, because now we understand what goes on between Claudia and Caroline. We understand what goes on between David and Claudia, and now we're ready for the Big Bang. Right? Now, David and Caroline talk to each other. Without Claudia? See, Claudia was like the psychosomatic trial, only it was behavioral, you know, whatever, but she was keeping the two from having conflict. And now, David and Caroline are face to face with each other. But you see how you can't do that in one step? That's what's important to learn from this chapter. They do it not so much with theory, we're adding the theory now, but what goes on in the chapter is you can't just say, all right, look, I have this Einfall in the back of my mind, I'm gonna, the real problem is the parents. You two talk to each other. That's, let's say that we weren't doing family therapy and we said, oh, well, let's do parental, counseling. David and Caroline, come in and talk about Claudia. It's not gonna work. Why isn't it gonna work? Because when they go home, Claudia's there. And there's much more power to Claudia doing her thing with David and driving Carolyn nuts than there is to having David and Carolyn talk to each other. They're not ready for it yet. You have to break the triangles in vivo. You have to bring the triangles in, separate them out, and go from one step to the other, and then you can get to David and Caroline, and then it can explode. The fact that it explodes is just life. There's a real explosion there. And then there's going to be an issue of an unresolvable conflict. And some of you sort of get to know David and Caroline a bit. So tell me, if you want, between David and Caroline, where would you put them? In the light and dark. Caroline wants the light on. What's the issue for David and Caroline? Would you say that the issue is control, respect, or closeness? The leading issue. It's always all of them. But what would you say is the leading issue with David and Caroline?
I would say closeness.
Closeness, right? And so that would make sense because what we have in the triangle is a pseudo-closeness and a pseudo-distance, right? So I would agree. But as you read David, the Bryce family, think about what's the leading issue. David feels unloved and distant. Carolyn feels that she can't be really loved. So what do they end up doing? They end up with a daughter whose symptoms are symptoms about closeness. Claudia's not trying to control anybody. She's not disrespecting anybody. But she is running away from the family. She doesn't feel that she can be loved by her mother, nor really loved by her father, who she is only for the triangle with the mother.
And so, it's the fact that she's playing it out with promiscuous behavior, connecting.
Right. Yeah, and she's, the promiscuity part of it is closeness, right? She's looking for some kind of closeness. It's not real closeness. That's what she has in the family. So do you see how that chapter works? Now if you read it over and say, okay, David and Caroline, we're getting to know them. There's this couple that cannot enter or resolve their conflict about closeness, right? And can you love me the way I am? And they have a daughter who's entered into that issue herself, created a kind of a triangle that and makes it, the triangle regulates but doesn't allow for intersubjective. And so we go from one to the next. We say, okay, the phenomenon of the symptom is Claudia's fighting with Caroline. X marks the spot. Start with that. Sometimes if you're an Ibra Chochem, which we all have this danger, once you start learning theory, then you sort of separate from reality. So, you say to yourself, okay, I know that this is a couple's problem here. I know it. How do I know it? Because I know it. Because I'm smart, and because I learned it, and because everybody says it. And so the origin of it, the origin, is the couple problem. Is that true? Ah. And so the solution is where the origin is. No. Got it? The origin is the origin. The solution does not start with the origin. The origin is the last place you can get to. You have to work through the way that the origin has led to different structures, and then you can get back to the origin. You can't start with the origin. Does that make sense to you? It's a very important point of therapy. It's a very important point of Freudian therapy, of any therapy. You start where the patient is. The patient, that's the thing that's the handle. You can start with that. So if the problem is with Caroline and Claudia, then you wouldn't say to yourself, I know it's a couple's problem. Don't bring Claudia to the room. Come the two of you and talk about your closeness. And they come and they mutter about closeness, and they go home and reorganize this with Claudia, because that's where it is. So in this kind of a situation, you can see why it makes sense to see the family together. Because then you can work on each aspect of the triangle, the Carol and Claudia part, then the David and Claudia part, and only then can you get to this point, the explosion. Okay? So,
If the couple comes in by themselves without the child, you won't ever get to the explosion?
yeah, if the couple comes in and what they're fighting about is the child, then you have to say to yourself, what's going on at home is with the child. I may need to see them together to change the triangle in vivo before I can talk about it. Now, will there be some families who can just talk about it? Will there be some families where David and Caroline will come in and say, look, we have this terribly upset teenage daughter, and you say to them, okay, well, teenagers, what were you like as a teenager, David? Right? What were you like as a teenager, and how did you come together, and what were your issues? And they say, oh, closest, oh, I got it, closest. And they go home and say to Claudia, listen, you're off the hook. We're figuring it out. Will that happen? Yes. In what families? In families with rather high differentiation, right? Because a triangle can happen, and this mess can happen at any level of differentiation. So families with a high level of differentiation, where you can say to David, what were you like as an adolescent? And David says, thank God somebody's finally asked me. You're in business, right? So seeing the couple, and they'll do the work at home, will happen the higher the differentiation is. But the lower the differentiation is, you say to David, what were you like as a teenager? And he said, I'm not going to pay for this session. I didn't come here to talk about myself. I came here for you to tell me what to do about my daughter. So Carolyn says, you see, that's what he's like, because that's what he's like with the daughter. I said, well, what were you like as a teenager? Would you stop telling this nonsense about, why are you bugging me about the origins? We're here. We have a daughter who we don't know how to talk. So that family with a lower differentiation, if you don't bring them in together, you're going to do blah, 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 and you're not going to get there, right? So you start to say to yourself, which therapy for whom we're going to get there at the end of the semester, rather than saying which is the right therapy. What are they able to do, and what are they not able to do? I just want to finish 2 slides, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. Now, that is Napier and Whitaker, right? At the time, Whitaker was the senior therapist. Napier was this, he wasn't any more experienced than you guys are. He was already a bit of a poet. He knew how to write, and Whitaker's writing was horrible, so Napier wrote the book. And it so happens that Napier was also in therapy with Whitaker at the time, he and his wife. Napier and his wife. So 20 years later, when Napier was an experienced couples therapist, he wrote the book that, anybody get to it, The Fragile Bond? Yeah, so The Fragile Bond. It's in the bibliography. Napier himself wrote a book called The Fragile Bond. Now you see, the Bryce family is one family. That's what makes the book so useful. It's one family. You can see how it goes. The Napier book is about one couple, he and his wife. It's an autobiographical couples book. It's a singular book. Aside from the fact that he's a marvelous writer, it's a singular book. It takes you through 30 years of this couple. And I'll just tell you one thing from the book, which is connected to couples and kinds of conflicts, because you won't find this anywhere else. You'll find almost everything else repeats itself endlessly. This is rather unique, and it comes with the following insights, which you may recognize from your neighbors. He said, you know, his name is Gus, and her name is Margaret, right? Gus says, you know, I didn't really marry Margaret. So how did I know who Margaret was? Who did I marry? The Margaret I thought I could make her to be, which would be the kind of Margaret that would be right for me. And as a matter of fact, Margaret didn't marry Gus. She married the Gus that she thought she could make me into when I would finally put my socks away or whatever it is. You know, that this is like, you know, everybody marries a golem who you think you can turn into what you need. So his autobiographical suggestion is the first level as a couple. The main issue of conflict is control. What is control about? About how could I make you this? What did I really need? Not that. This. You know. Could you please step over here? You remember assimilation with Piaget? Right? Could you please step into my map? That isn't in my map. Step into this map. That's who you're supposed to be. That's the person I married, but that's not the person I am. Well, work harder at it, right? Both sides. So that's like an issue of control. Maybe you've heard about that from your neighbors. And then you get to a point in the couples. In Gus and Margaret, it took 10 years. Sometimes it takes 2 years. Sometimes it takes 20 years. Sometimes it's the next generation or the next Gilgul. But for them, it took 10 years because they're both therapists and they've been treated by Whitaker. But that didn't mean they didn't have issues. So the next level of the issue was, we said, I'm really married to Margaret. I'm not going to change her. I'm really married to Gus. He's not going to fit into my map. He's somebody different. And she's somebody different. Then you get this interesting crisis, which you'll see when couples come in. It's an extraordinarily important I think, insight, which is not registered elsewhere, which is that they're in a crisis of closeness, right? They're saying, I really am married to somebody different from who I thought I was married to, but this is a unique individual there. And now the issue is, can I be close to this individual? Can I be close to somebody who's not the mirror of what I wanted, but somebody unique and different from me, from both sides? So you get into an explosion of closeness. You suddenly feel, if this is going to work, it's just the two of us. And those extra figures of, you know, who I needed and who I needed, they're not here. It's just the two of us. Good Lord, how are we going to live together? That's the second. That doesn't happen at the beginning. That happens later on, right? The first, you know, you're busy getting the person into the map, and then, there's no map. It's just the two of us. And you'll find couples who are at a crisis, which is because they're looking for this understanding. And then the third one, which is also very interesting, which has to do more with respect, is that another 10 years later, they started to have a discussion about not who I thought you were going to be, but who my mother thought you were going to be, and who my father thought you were going to be. And it turns out that in the families of origin, there were extra triangles, there were extra noises. For example, in Gus's case, Margaret's father said to her, a poet? A poet? What kind of a husband is going to be a poet? He's totally irresponsible. He doesn't think about the stock market. He doesn't know how to invest. He doesn't get up in the morning and drive a truck. Irresponsible. And that lived in Margaret's mind for 20 years. Right? These extra sort of noises that come from the families of origin. You know, okay, I realize that I'm with you, but you're actually irresponsible. Where did that voice come from? And the same thing with Gus, who's been married to Margaret for 20 years, and he says, I'm not sure you're really beautiful. 20 years into it, I'm not sure you're really beautiful. Oh, okay, let's hear the echoes. And the echo was, that's what my mother said. My mother said, look, Gus, you're a handsome guy. You couldn't find somebody, she's a little homely. She's not, a model. She's a little homely. So Gus is living for 20 years with the voice of his mother who says that Margaret's a little homely. And Margaret is living for 20 years with this extra voice that says that he's not really responsible. And when they finally get to figure those things out, then you get a higher level of differentiation, right? You leave those triangles alone, and Gus is able to say, look, this is how I look at you. I'm putting my mother's voice aside. Not an easy thing to do. Depends on the level of differentiation. So those three levels of, they're chronological levels of particular kinds of conflicts in couples. The first one will tend to be one of control, who you have to be. The second one will be one of closeness, which is who are you really? And the third is one of respect, which is how can I separate those other voices and respect you for who you are. That's something you won't find anywhere else.